You think burying it will help?
That badge doesn't protect you anymore.
What the hell did she say?
The land takes back what's its own.
Josie? You been out here all night?
She wasn't the only one who died. Why me?
Because you're still here.
You took everything.
You think burying it will help?
Eli stood at the edge of the property, watching the barn burn. The orange glow reflected in his eyes, hard and unmoving. His hands hung at his sides, stiff, as if even the flames couldn't shake the numbness inside him. He'd spent years building that barn. Now it was nothing but ash. The heat bit into the air, the crackle of fire sharp, punctuating the silence that stretched between him and the woman behind him. "You'll lose it all." The voice came from Josie. She hadn't spoken much since she'd arrived a year ago, but when she did, it always felt like something buried, something old and hidden deep in her throat. Eli didn't turn around to face her, though he could feel the weight of her presence creeping up behind him. "Stay back, Josie," he muttered, keeping his eyes on the fire. The barn was gone now, but the damage was done. But Josie wasn't listening. She stepped forward, her feet bare against the dirt, her face set, wild-eyed. The flame flickered across her features. "Fire's just the start," she said, her voice steady but cold. Eli's chest tightened. He glanced over his shoulder, catching her eyes for a moment. Something about the way she spoke, the way she stood there as if the fire didn't bother her, it unsettled him. There was a truth in her words, something he didn't want to hear. "Get away from it," Eli barked, his voice raw. "I don't need you in this." "Not now." Josie didn't move. Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, Eli noticed the sharpness in them, the kind that made you think of things you couldn't see, things better left alone. There was nothing comforting about her presence anymore. It was like standing too close to a storm, knowing it was coming but unable to stop it. She didn't speak again, just stood there, unmoving, as if the fire was hers to command. Eli turned back to the barn, but the words lingered in his mind, twisting into something darker, something more urgent. "Fire's just the start." The barn fell in on itself with a groan, sending a final burst of sparks into the air. Eli's throat tightened. This was just the beginning. And Josie? She was at the heart of it. The heat from the fire grew unbearable, but Eli didn't move. He just kept staring at the flames, letting them burn into him. When Josie's voice came again, it was quieter, but no less piercing. "You'll lose it all, Eli." He clenched his fists and turned on his heel. She was standing there, staring out at the wreckage. "It's already gone," he said, his voice tight, strained. "The barn, the land, hell, even my sanity." Josie didn't flinch. "It's not just the barn, Eli." She finally turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. "It's everything you've ever built. It's already burning." Eli didn't know what to say to that. He opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he just stared at her, the unease inside him growing, spreading. He didn't know what it was, fear, anger, or something worse. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew Josie had always been tied to the land, to this place in ways that went beyond his understanding. The fire was just the beginning. But of what? And why? "I'll deal with it," Eli said, more to himself than to her. His gaze hardened again, this time focused on the ground beneath his feet. "I'll deal with it all." But Josie just shook her head, the darkness in her eyes never wavering. "You can't fix what's already broken." Eli wanted to argue, but there was no fight in him. Instead, he stood there, the heat from the fire beginning to feel like a distant thing, something that didn't belong to him anymore. The night stretched on. The barn was a heap of rubble now, smoldering in the moonlight. Eli stood on the porch, his gaze locked on the ruin. It had been his, and now it was gone. He didn't know what to do with the emptiness that had settled in its place. Josie hadn't moved since she spoke. She was still out there, standing near the barn, her silhouette dark against the fire's dying glow. She'd stopped being a girl a long time ago, and now, she was something else entirely. Eli rubbed his hand over his face, wiping away the sweat and the ash, but it did nothing to shake the feeling that everything, his whole life, was slipping away from him. He had nothing left but this land, this broken, barren place. And Josie. The sound of her voice broke through the silence again. You can't fix it. Eli's jaw clenched. He wanted to shout at her, to tell her to leave, to get out of his life. But he didn't. There was something about the way she stood there, something that kept him rooted in place. She was the only thing left on this land, the only one who understood what it was to lose everything. And he hated her for it. I'm not trying to fix it, he muttered, his voice strained. I'm trying to survive. Josie didn't respond. She never did, not in the way he wanted. She just stayed there, staring into the remnants of the fire, her eyes reflecting something too dark to name. And Eli? He just stood there, helpless, watching the last part of his life burn away. He wondered, briefly, if it was her doing. If Josie was the one who had set the fire. But the thought slipped away before it could settle. He didn't want to know the answer. Didn't want to see it for what it really was. The fire died, the last embers fading into the dark, and in that silence, Eli understood one thing. The fire had consumed everything. And now, it was waiting for something else to burn. He didn't know if it was Josie or the land or something in himself, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. Josie had warned him. Fire was only the beginning. Eli stood in the blackened remains of the barn, staring at what had once been the walls, the beams, the roof. The fire had eaten it all. There was nothing left but charred wood and smoldering embers. The smell of smoke hung heavy in the air, mixing with the dust and the burnt earth. His throat was raw from the smoke, but the ache in his chest was sharper. He had spent years building that barn, and now it was gone. And Josie? She had watched it burn, standing outside, untouched by the destruction. He couldn't bring himself to move, couldn't bring himself to do anything but stare at the ruin in front of him. His hands were covered in ash, and when he wiped them on his pants, they came away dark and stained. The land didn't care. It never had. A sound broke the silence. The soft scrape of boots on the dirt. Eli turned, half expecting to see the sheriff, Mitch, or someone else from town, but it was Josie. She stood in the doorway of what was left of the barn, her hands folded in front of her, like she was waiting for something to happen. Get to work, Eli said, his voice rough. Josie didn't answer, just watched him with those eyes of hers, steady, unblinking. It was like she was waiting for him to break, waiting for him to give up, and part of him wanted to. He could feel the weight of the land, of everything that had gone wrong in his life, pressing down on him. But there was no time for that. He took a step forward and reached for the shovel lying in the dirt. The remnants of a burned letter lay nearby, half burned and half whole, barely recognizable. The wind stirred the ashes around it, but he didn't care. He grabbed the shovel and thrust it into the earth, pulling up a chunk of dirt. Josie didn't move. You think burying it will help? Eli asked, his voice low, his hands shaking as he scooped more dirt into the pile. His words felt like a challenge, but they were hollow, like everything else in his life. Josie didn't respond right away. She just stood there, her gaze never wavering. Finally, she stepped forward, picking up the charred remains of the letter with her bare hands, unbothered by the heat. Eli wanted to tell her to leave it, but he couldn't. She was already too close to the ruin. She turned it over in her hands, her fingers brushing the burnt edges. Some things are meant to stay buried, Josie said, her voice quiet but certain. Some things aren't. Eli watched her, the words catching in his throat. She was holding something of his wife's, something he had thought lost to time. Clara's handwriting, half-formed, fading, but still unmistakable. The letter had been from a time before the fire, before everything changed. He had buried so many things already, so many pieces of himself. But this letter? This letter was the last thing connecting him to her. You shouldn't have. Eli started, but the words died in his mouth. Josie didn't look at him. She just held the letter in her hands and turned away, walking toward the back of the barn. Eli stood there, staring after her, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to ask her what she knew. He didn't want to know what she was carrying. But part of him already did. Josie had become a part of this place, a part of the land. She understood things Eli didn't. She knew the stories, the secrets. Josie, he called, his voice quieter now. What do you want from me? She didn't turn around, but he could feel the tension in her shoulders. I don't want anything from you, Eli. Not anymore. Her words hung in the air like the smoke still lingering around them. Eli stood frozen, the shovel still in his hand, and something shifted in him. It wasn't a feeling he could place exactly, but it was there. Something heavy, something dark. He didn't want to believe it, but he could already feel the truth of it. She wasn't just some orphan he had taken in a year ago. She wasn't just a lost girl. She was something else, something tied to this place in ways Eli couldn't even understand. And in that moment, as he watched her walk away, he realized that whatever had started with the fire, whatever Josie had brought with her, wasn't something that would go away. Not easily. She disappeared into the smoke, her silhouette blending with the ruins of the barn, leaving Eli alone with his thoughts. The sun had started to set, casting long shadows over the scorched earth. Eli stayed in the barn, unable to leave, unable to move. His eyes fixed on the pile of ash and burned wood, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on the land, on the girl, and on the things he had buried for far too long. Josie had given him the shovel. And now, it was as if he was digging up the past again, whether he wanted to or not. When Eli finally made his way back to the house, he found Josie sitting on the porch, her back to him. She was staring out at the empty land, her face unreadable. You still here? He asked, his voice flat. Josie didn't answer right away, but her silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was like she was waiting for him to speak first. I told you to stay back, Eli added, stepping closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. I don't listen to you, Josie said, her voice soft but firm. Eli stopped in his tracks. The words stung, but they were true. She never did listen. Not to him, not to anyone. Why'd you take it? Eli asked, looking down at the burned letter she still held in her hands. I didn't take anything, Josie said, her voice low. You let it burn. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, but neither of them spoke again. Eli stood there for a long while, trying to make sense of everything, of Josie, of the fire, of the land. But nothing made sense. Josie finally stood, her gaze never leaving the horizon. It's all burning, Eli. And you can't stop it. Eli turned away, his heart pounding. The fire had taken everything, and now, it was like the land was calling for something else. Something darker. Josie's words stuck in his mind. And for the first time, Eli realized they weren't just about the barn. They were about him, about everything he had built, everything he had lost. And deep down, Eli knew he couldn't stop it. He couldn't fix it. The fire had only just begun. The sound of boots scraping against dry dirt was the only thing that broke the quiet morning. Eli didn't look up at first. He knew who it was. The heavy, deliberate footsteps, the shift in the air when someone approached, he could feel it. He wiped his brow, the dust still in the air from last night's fire, and took another long drag from the bottle. His throat was dry, and his eyes felt heavier every day. Morning, Eli, Mitch said, his voice rough, like gravel grinding underfoot. The sheriff's hat tipped forward, casting his face in shadow, but the hard lines of age and guilt were still visible. Eli didn't respond right away. Mitch took a few more steps forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. Barn's gone, I see. The sheriff's voice was flat, but there was something in it, a trace of judgment. What happened? Eli didn't answer at first, staring at the empty space where the barn once stood. the fire was only part of it. The rest of it? It was like a part of him was still burning somewhere, and the land had taken it with the fire. You can't hide from it, Mitch continued, his voice dipping into something darker. Fires don't just happen, Eli. Not out here. Someone said it. Eli finally looked up. Don't come here telling me what I know, Mitch. I'm not your damn criminal. Mitch stood there, watching him with a steady gaze. You think the fire was an accident? Not with everything that's been going on. You think your barn's the only thing that's gonna burn? Eli stood, jaw tight. I said don't come here telling me how this works. I don't need your badge telling me what's right and what's wrong. His hand clenched tighter around the bottle in his grip. You and your damn badge. Mitch's eyes flicked down to the bottle in Eli's hand. The sheriff took a slow step forward, but his voice had no warmth in it now. You're right. Maybe I'm just here for the truth. But the truth, Eli, ain't just something you bury under ashes. Eli dropped the bottle, the clink of it hitting the dirt sharper than the quiet that followed. He turned, walking a few paces away, his boots kicking up the dry ground. His gaze went back to the empty space where the barn had stood. There were a lot of things buried here, things Eli had hidden for too long. And for the first time, standing in front of Mitch, it felt like they were starting to surface. Behind him, Josie stood silently at the edge of the porch. She had been quiet for a while now. Watching. Waiting. He could feel her eyes on him. Like she knew what was coming, even if he didn't. What do you want, Mitch? Eli said, his voice low, tight. I don't need you poking around. Mitch shifted on his feet, then slowly pulled something from his belt. The old badge faded, worn, the metal scratched from years of use, caught the light for a moment. It gleamed dully. I think you know what I want, Eli. You've been sitting on a lot of things. And the land? It doesn't forget. Eli didn't turn around, but his stomach twisted. The badge felt like a weight on his chest. Josie was still standing there, the silence between them a heavy thing. The badge was a symbol, a mark of power. And in that moment, Eli felt like it was being thrust into his face, a reminder of all he had tried to outrun. You think you can hide behind that badge forever? Eli said, his voice rising, the anger catching up with him. This land ain't yours, Mitch. It ain't anybody's. It doesn't owe you anything. Josie's voice broke through the tension, low and unsettling. The land takes back what's its own, doesn't it, Mitch? Mitch's head snapped toward her, eyes narrowing. You got something to say, girl? Josie didn't flinch. She just stood there, barefoot, her face a mask of calm. You don't protect it. You never did. Her words were quiet, but there was something in the air around her that made them sharp. Eli turned, a flicker of something cold rising in his chest. Josie hadn't spoken to Mitch in months, not since she'd arrived. Mitch's grip on the badge tightened, the muscles in his jaw tensing. You think you know how this works? How long you think you can stay here, Josie? Eli didn't move, but he felt the shift in the air. Mitch wasn't just after him anymore. Josie had been standing there, watching quietly, but now she was the one drawing the tension in the room. The old sheriff's face darkened, his eyes flicking between her and Eli. You think you know what this land's about? What's been buried here? Mitch's voice dropped lower, something dangerous creeping into his tone. That badge, it's been the only thing keeping things from coming undone. You think I don't know what this place holds? Josie took a step forward, her eyes never leaving Mitch's. You're all tied to it. To this land. You think the badge means anything when it's already rotting? The air between them was thick. Mitch didn't respond. He just stared at Josie, but something in his eyes flickered. Something that said he knew exactly what she meant. And for a moment, Eli saw it, the thing that Mitch had been hiding under that badge. It was guilt, and it was rooted deep in the dirt, in the land, and in everything Mitch had tried to bury. Eli's fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't sure if it was Josie who had pushed Mitch to this point or if it was just the years of tension finally breaking through. "You think you can come in here and start changing things?" Mitch finally said, his voice rough and full of a bitterness that matched the air around them. "This land's been holding onto its debts for too long, Eli. You've been hiding. You've been running." Eli turned back to Mitch, his gaze hard. "You think you're the one who can fix it? This land doesn't owe you anything. You're just like the rest of them, just like the ones who died for it." Mitch's face shifted, something like recognition flashing in his eyes. He stepped back, staring at the two of them. The badge gleamed in his hand again, but this time it seemed less like a symbol of power and more like a burden he was tired of carrying. "Keep running, Eli," Mitch said, his voice low, almost weary. "But remember, the land's got a way of making people pay." Without another word, Mitch turned and walked off, his boots heavy on the ground, each step taking him farther away from Eli, farther away from the ranch, but not from the past. Not from the debts. Josie didn't speak until Mitch was gone, his figure disappearing down the road. "You've been burying a lot, Eli," she said quietly, her voice softer than before, but with something deeper in it. "And now, it's time for it to come up." Eli turned to her. The anger, the frustration, all of it seemed to melt away. What was left? He wasn't sure anymore. Josie's eyes held him, steady and sure, like she knew the land better than he ever would. "You should have let it burn," Josie murmured, turning away. "But it's not about the barn. Not anymore." Eli swallowed hard, staring at the ground. She was right. It had never been about the barn. The morning light barely reached the edge of the porch. Eli sat on the steps, eyes on the land stretching out in front of him, the place that had once felt like home, now a hollowed-out version of itself. The quiet weighed on him more than he wanted to admit. Josie hadn't said a word since Mitch had left. She hadn't said much at all lately, and that bothered him. When she did speak, it always felt like she was talking around something, like she was testing the air before the storm hit. But today, she was even quieter than usual. Eli looked over his shoulder. The house was still standing, but it was a ruin in its own right, creaking, worn down by years of neglect, by things left unsaid. The fire hadn't reached it, but everything else felt like it had burned. There were memories here, memories of Clara, his wife. They were as buried as the ashes from the barn, but they still had weight. Josie was the only thing here now, the only one who could see through him, who could make him face what he was too scared to look at. He heard the soft scrape of boots behind him. He didn't need to turn to know it was Josie. "Been up all night?" he asked, his voice raw, still thick from the smoke. Josie didn't answer. She never did when it came to questions like that. She just stood there, looking out toward the barn's remains, her gaze distant. It was like she wasn't really there, like she was still back in the fire, still wrapped in the smoke and the heat. Eli shifted on the steps, discomfort prickling under his skin. He couldn't stand this silence, not anymore. "I'm not gonna keep pretending everything's fine, Josie. I can't." Still, she didn't speak. Her silence, once comforting, now felt like a weight pressing down on him, suffocating. He could feel it, the heaviness that had settled between them. The silence stretched long and unforgiving, and Eli hated it. He hated how it seemed to crawl into every corner of his life. It wasn't just Josie's silence. It was his own, too. Finally, she moved. Her footsteps were soft, but they cut through the quiet, reminding Eli that she was still there, that she was still something else, something more. Josie stopped in front of him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of smoke still clinging to her clothes. She looked down at him, her eyes dark, unreadable. "You think I'm the one who's keeping you here?" she asked, her voice low, steady. Eli blinked, surprised by the question. He opened his mouth to answer but found the words caught in his throat. What could he say? What was left to say when everything had been buried under the weight of all this silence? "I didn't come here to save you," Josie continued, her gaze piercing through him, through the cracks in his defenses. "I came because I was already a part of it. A part of the land. A part of you." Eli swallowed, the weight of her words sinking in. It wasn't just about the fire. It wasn't just about the barn. Josie had been a part of this place long before he'd ever let her stay, long before the fire had torn through everything he thought he knew. "I didn't ask you to come," Eli said, his voice quieter now, tired. He couldn't meet her eyes. He wasn't sure he wanted to. Josie didn't respond immediately. She just stood there, her face unreadable. The wind kicked up, and a gust of dust swirled around them. It felt like the land itself was waiting for something to change. After a long pause, Josie spoke again. "You can't keep running, Eli. It's not the land that's gonna get you. It's you." Eli flinched, the words cutting deep. He stood abruptly, the movement sharp, almost desperate. "You don't know anything about me, Josie," he snapped, his voice rising. "You don't know what I've done, what I've lost. You don't know how it feels to be buried alive in this place." Josie didn't flinch. She stood there, her posture straight, calm. "I know more than you think." Eli's breath hitched in his chest. His mind flashed back to the things he'd buried, the way he'd tried to forget Clara, tried to forget all the things they'd lost. The land, the fire, the badge, none of it had really changed what he couldn't escape. It wasn't the land that was going to break him. It was everything he had refused to face. "I'm not running," Eli said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm just tired." Josie stepped closer, her face softening, but there was still that edge in her eyes, the same thing that had always been there, waiting for him to finally understand. "You think you can fix it, Eli? You can't. You can't fix what's already broken." Eli stared at her, his chest tight, his breath shallow. He could feel the walls closing in on him again, the familiar ache settling back into his bones. "Then what do you want me to do?" he asked, the question coming out raw, desperate. Josie met his gaze, and for a moment, there was something in her eyes, a flicker of understanding, of shared grief. "You have to let go, Eli. You have to let it burn. The past, the guilt, the land, it's all part of it." Eli stood there, his heart thudding in his chest. The fire had burned the barn, yes. But it had also burned away a piece of him he didn't know was still there. He had thought the land would keep him, that the earth would hold him in place, but it hadn't. It never would. Josie turned away, walking slowly toward the well near the barn, her footsteps soft against the ground. Eli watched her, his hands trembling, but he didn't follow her. Not yet. He wasn't sure he was ready for whatever it was she was asking of him. He wasn't sure he was ready to face the things that had been buried, things that had been left to rot beneath the surface of this land. The silence returned, heavy and thick, as Josie stood by the well. The wind picked up again, swirling around them, but neither of them moved. They were both stuck in this place, held together by the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. Eli finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to let go." Josie didn't turn to look at him, but her voice came back, quiet and steady. "You don't have to. The land will take it from you." Eli watched her, the words settling into the space between them. The land would take it. It always did. And for the first time in a long time, Eli felt like he was finally ready to let it. The land had always been full of secrets. Eli had known that long before Josie had come into his life, but now it felt different. The silence between them, between him and the land, had deepened since the fire. The air was thick with it, heavy with things that weren't said, with things that couldn't be buried. Eli stood at the edge of the field, his boots planted firmly in the dry earth, staring out at the horizon. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the landscape. The ranch had never looked as barren as it did now. Not even the trees seemed to stand straight anymore. Everything was leaning, giving way to the weight of time. Josie was silent again, her figure just visible in the distance, standing by the well. Eli didn't know what she was waiting for. He didn't know what he was waiting for. But something had shifted, something that made the quiet feel heavier than it had before. "Josie," he called, his voice low, but carrying across the land. She didn't turn around. Eli sighed and walked toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel. He felt the weight of his own footsteps, the sound of them too loud in the stillness. She didn't move as he approached, her back to him, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. "You've been standing there for hours," Eli said, trying to keep his tone light, though he could feel the tension in his chest. Josie didn't respond. She never did, not when the silence between them was like this. But Eli knew that she could feel it too, that tension, that unspoken thing that hung between them, like a thread ready to snap. When he reached her, Josie turned slowly, her eyes dark, unreadable. Her gaze flicked over him, as if measuring him, as if looking through him, to something buried deep inside. "We need to go," Josie said, her voice low but steady. Eli frowned. "Go where?" "To the grave," Josie replied, her words almost too soft to hear. "The one you've been hiding from." Eli's heart skipped a beat. He didn't need to ask what she meant. He knew. The grave was something he had buried long ago, something he had never meant to be found. He hadn't even thought about it in years. But now, standing here in front of Josie, it felt like it was coming back, like it had been waiting all this time for someone to finally see it. "I'm not taking you there," Eli said, his voice tight, even though he knew it was futile. Josie had already seen more than she should have. She had already touched the things that had been buried, the things that Eli had tried to forget. Josie didn't argue. She simply turned and started walking, her steps slow but determined. Eli stood there for a moment, watching her, feeling the pull of something he didn't understand. Then, with a long, heavy breath, he followed her. The path to the grave was hidden, off the main road, tucked away in the corner of the property where the land felt different. The air was thicker here, the soil darker. The trees were sparse, their branches twisted and knotted, like the roots had long ago tangled into something that couldn't be undone. The land here felt old, ancient in a way that made Eli uneasy. Josie walked ahead, her feet light on the earth, like she was connected to it in a way that Eli couldn't explain. He tried to keep his distance, but every step he took felt like he was being pulled closer to something he couldn't escape. When they reached the spot, Josie stopped. She didn't look at him. She simply knelt down, her fingers brushing the earth. Eli's heart pounded in his chest, and he felt a knot in his stomach as he realized what she was doing. "No," he muttered, his voice low, but Josie didn't stop. She kept digging, the earth giving way beneath her hands like it had been waiting for this moment. Slowly, the outline of a grave began to take shape. Eli's throat tightened, and for the first time since the fire, he felt something like panic rising in him. "You don't need to do this, Josie," he said, his voice shaking. "You don't need to know this." But Josie didn't answer. She kept digging, her hands steady, her eyes fixed on the ground. It was like she had known this grave was here all along, like she had been waiting for Eli to face it. The first glimpse of the coffin came into view, its edges rough and weathered, the wood warped by years of dirt and decay. Eli's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to run. He wanted to turn around and walk away, but he couldn't. Something in him, the same thing that had kept him here all this time, made him stay, made him watch as Josie uncovered the past he had buried so deeply. Josie paused when the coffin was fully exposed, her hands resting on the edges of the grave. "It's not just about Clara, is it, Eli?" she said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. "There's more here. Something you haven't told anyone." Eli stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, pushing him towards something he wasn't ready to face. But Josie was right. The grave wasn't just for Clara. It wasn't just her body that had been buried here. It was everything, the guilt, the shame, the pieces of himself he had tried to forget. "Don't," Eli said, his voice thick. He reached for the coffin, his fingers trembling. "Just don't." But Josie wasn't stopping. She reached out and lifted the lid, revealing the rotted remains inside. There was nothing left of Clara, not really. Only bones, the remnants of a life that had once been, now nothing more than dust. Eli's stomach turned, and he stepped back, his hands shaking at his sides. He wanted to scream, to shout, to bury it all again. But Josie stood there, unmoving, her gaze steady as she watched him. "You've been carrying this for too long," Josie said, her voice low, like she was speaking to a child. "You've been carrying this guilt, this weight. And it's not just hers, Eli. It's yours too. Eli closed his eyes, the words cutting through him like a blade. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to face it. But it was too late now. The land had taken it all. It had taken his past, his secrets, and now it was taking him. He opened his eyes and looked at Josie. For the first time, he saw something in her, something softer, something that wasn't as hard as he had imagined. "You're not alone," Josie said, her voice quiet but steady. "Not anymore." Eli looked down at the grave, at the remnants of the past. He could feel the weight lifting, just a little, but it was enough. The silence between them wasn't suffocating anymore. It was just a space for something new to grow. Something that didn't have to be buried. Eli nodded slowly, the weight of it still heavy, but a little easier to bear. "It's done," he said, his voice hoarse. Josie didn't say anything more. She just stood up, brushing the dirt off her hands. Together, they turned and walked away, leaving the past where it belonged. The fire wasn't an accident. Eli knew it now. He'd always known, but he hadn't been able to admit it. The crackling of the flames had whispered to him, had teased at something buried deep in his chest. And as the wind carried the ashes across the land, he realized it wasn't just the barn that was burning. It was everything. His life. His choices. His past. He stood in the yard, staring out at the charred remnants of what had once been his home. The sky was heavy with the threat of another storm, but Eli didn't care. The land had already taken everything from him. What was another storm going to do? Behind him, Josie stood in the doorway of the house, her arms crossed, watching him with a look he couldn't quite place. It wasn't pity. It wasn't anger. It was something else, something older, like she knew this was coming. "You're still here," she said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was distant, like she was talking about something that wasn't even worth acknowledging. Eli didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure what to say. The weight of the fire, of everything that had happened, was pressing down on him. It felt like the air was thick with smoke, the taste of it lingering on his tongue. "I don't know why I'm still here," he muttered, almost to himself. "Everything's gone. It's all burned. I don't have anything left." Josie didn't respond. She didn't need to. Eli knew that. She had seen it all before, seen the pieces of him that he couldn't even look at. She'd watched him lose everything, piece by piece, and still, she didn't say a word. She just stood there, waiting for him to understand. The wind picked up, blowing dust and ash around him. Eli felt the heat from the fire still clinging to the air, a reminder that it hadn't just been the barn that had burned. It had been the whole damn place. "You ever wonder if it's all just a circle?" Eli asked, his voice rough. "Like we're all just going around and around, burning the same things over and over again, until there's nothing left?" Josie stepped forward then, her eyes fixed on him. "Maybe you've been burning the wrong things," she said quietly. Eli looked at her, his chest tightening. She wasn't wrong. He had burned everything. His wife. The land. The memories. And now, there was nothing left but ashes. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," he said, his voice breaking. I thought the land would fix me. I thought it would hold me together." Josie's expression softened, just a little. She stepped closer to him, the dirt crunching under her boots. "The land doesn't fix anything, Eli. It takes. It always takes." Eli felt the weight of her words settle into his bones. She was right. The land didn't fix anything. It just took. And he had given it everything, his wife, his past, his soul, and still, it wasn't enough. It never would be. "Then what the hell am I supposed to do?" Eli asked, his voice desperate, shaking. "I've got nothing left. The land took it all." Josie reached out, her hand brushing his arm, a small gesture, but it felt like everything in that moment. "You still have you, Eli. You've still got yourself. That's the only thing the land can't take from you." Eli turned to face her, his breath shallow. For the first time in what felt like forever, he really looked at her. There was something in her eyes, something that wasn't just about the fire or the land or the past. It was something deeper, something he didn't understand but felt like he was beginning to see. "You think I can change?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Josie didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, her gaze steady. "You don't need to change, Eli. You just need to stop running." Eli's heart skipped a beat. "Stop running," he repeated. "From what?" Josie stepped back, her eyes never leaving his. "From yourself. From the things you buried. From the things you think you can't face." Eli felt like the ground had shifted beneath him, like he was standing on something that had always been there but he had never noticed. It wasn't the land that had been holding him together. It wasn't the barn or the house or the fire. It was something inside him, something that had always been there, buried just like everything else. The wind howled through the trees, the sound of it like a warning, but Eli didn't move. He was standing on the edge of something, and he didn't know if he was ready to step forward or if he was about to fall. "You think you can just walk away from all of it?" Eli asked, his voice rising. "You think you can just leave it all behind and start fresh?" Josie looked at him, her expression calm, but there was something in her eyes that made Eli feel like she knew something he didn't. "You've been carrying it for too long, Eli. The fire wasn't the end. It was just the beginning." Eli's chest tightened. "The beginning of what?" Josie didn't answer right away. She turned and started walking toward the edge of the property, toward the place where the barn had been, where the fire had started. Eli watched her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Come on," she said over her shoulder. "Let's finish it." Eli didn't know what she meant. He didn't know what he was supposed to finish. But he followed her, his feet moving on their own, like he was being pulled forward by something he couldn't see. They stopped near the edge of the burned-out barn, the smoke still rising in thin tendrils from the ashes. The ground was scorched, the earth still hot beneath their feet. Josie didn't say anything as she crouched down and dug her hands into the dirt, pulling up a handful of earth. Eli stood there, watching her, feeling like he was watching a piece of his life fall away with each movement she made. She wasn't afraid of the fire, of the past, of the land. She was the one thing that hadn't burned, the one thing that had stayed. "You can't keep burying it, Eli," Josie said, her voice soft but firm. "You've got to face it. All of it." Eli looked down at the ground, the weight of her words sinking into him. He had been running from it all, the fire, the land, the ghosts of his past. But now, standing here with Josie, he realized that it wasn't the fire that had burned him. It was the way he had let everything he cared about slip away without ever facing it. He knelt down beside her, his hands trembling as he dug into the earth. The land had taken everything from him, but maybe, just maybe, it was time to take something back. The smoke was still rising, but Eli felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. The fire had taken the barn, yes. But it had also given him something else. It had given him a chance to stop running. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start again. The land was quiet now. The fire had burned everything it could, and what was left behind felt like an empty shell, a place stripped bare of anything that once meant something. But as Eli stood at the edge of the ruin, watching the first light of dawn break over the horizon, he realized that the quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was something else. It was the beginning of something. He couldn't quite name it yet, but it was there, beneath the ashes, beneath the silence. Josie had disappeared again, like she always did when things felt too heavy. She'd always been like that, a ghost in the land, a part of it that no one could understand. Eli wasn't sure if she'd ever really belonged here, or if she was just here to see him through this, to help him face the things he'd been running from. But for the first time since she'd come into his life, he wasn't afraid of what she represented. She wasn't a curse. She wasn't an answer. She was just there, and that was enough. He ran his hand through his hair, wiping away the sweat, and turned back to the house. The sun was rising now, casting a pale light over the ruins of the barn. It looked different today, less like something lost and more like something waiting. Waiting for him to decide what came next. His boots crunched on the gravel as he made his way back to the porch, where the wind had died down and the dust had settled. The silence was less suffocating now, less like a wall pressing in on him. Inside, the house was still as it had always been, empty, worn, haunted. But the smell of smoke was fading, and with it, the feeling that the place was closing in on him. Maybe it wasn't the house that was the problem. Maybe it was him. Eli moved through the room slowly, his hand brushing over the familiar surfaces, the old table in the kitchen, the empty chairs, the window where Clara used to sit. He stopped by the door to the bedroom, his hand resting on the frame, his eyes closed. He hadn't been in there since the fire. It felt like it had been years, even though it had only been weeks. But now, standing in the quiet of the house, he didn't feel the weight of the past on his shoulders. He didn't feel Clara's absence like he had before. The grief was still there, lingering, but it didn't feel like it was suffocating him anymore. It felt like something he could carry, something he could finally face. The door creaked open, and Eli stepped inside. The room was just as it had always been, but it was different now. It wasn't the room of a man who had lost everything. It was the room of someone who was learning to live again. Josie was sitting on the bed, her back to him, her eyes focused on something he couldn't see. The weight of her presence didn't feel as heavy as it had before. It felt familiar. "You're still here," Eli said, his voice rough from the silence. Josie turned her head, just enough to meet his eyes. There was something soft in her gaze, something that wasn't there before. "I told you I wasn't leaving." Eli stepped closer, the air thick with unspoken words. He didn't know what to say, didn't know if he was ready for what came next. But something in him felt different now, lighter, like a burden had been lifted. Maybe it wasn't the fire that had burned away everything, maybe it was Josie. Maybe it was time. "I don't know what comes after this," he said, his voice quieter now. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do." Josie stood slowly, crossing the room toward him. She didn't say anything, just stood there, her eyes never leaving his. And for the first time, Eli felt something shift between them, something real, something that wasn't tied to the land or the fire or the past. "You don't need to know," Josie said, her voice steady. "You just have to keep going. That's all any of us can do." Eli looked down at his hands, the calluses from years of hard work, from building and breaking and rebuilding. He hadn't realized it before, but he had always been running from the land, from his past, from everything he thought he knew. But now, as he stood there in the quiet house with Josie, he realized he didn't have to run anymore. He didn't have to escape. He could stay. "I'm still here," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't know how, but I'm still here." Josie reached out, her hand brushing against his, the touch light but grounding. "That's all that matters." The silence settled between them, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful, like the world had shifted just enough for them to breathe. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. The air between them was full of understanding, of shared grief and shared strength. It wasn't about fixing anything, about making everything right. It was about acceptance, accepting what had been lost, accepting what had been found, and accepting the fact that, for the first time in a long time, Eli didn't feel the need to run. The sun was fully up now, casting its light across the land, and Eli knew that whatever came next, whatever the land took from him, whatever the fire had burned, he would face it. Not alone. Not anymore. With Josie by his side, the weight of the past didn't feel so heavy. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't suffocating him either. And for the first time in years, Eli felt the faintest stirring of hope. "Let's start again," he said, his voice quieter now, as if he were speaking to the land, to the house, to the ashes of the barn. Josie didn't answer, but she didn't need to. She simply nodded, and together, they stepped outside. The ranch was still a ruin. The land was still scarred. But for the first time, it felt like there was room for something new. Something they could build together. And as the sun rose higher, Eli took a deep breath, ready for whatever came next. They were still here. They were still alive. And that was enough. Josie stood slowly, crossing the room toward him. She didn't say anything, just stood there, her eyes never leaving his. And for the first time, Eli felt something shift between them, something real, something that wasn't tied to the land or the fire or the past. "You don't need to know," Josie said, her voice steady. "You just have to keep going. That's all any of us can do." Eli looked down at his hands, the calluses from years of hard work, from building and breaking and rebuilding. He hadn't realized it before, but he had always been running from the land, from his past, from everything he thought he knew. But now, as he stood there in the quiet house with Josie, he realized he didn't have to run anymore. He didn't have to escape. He could stay. "I'm still here," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't know how, but I'm still here." Josie reached out, her hand brushing against his, the touch light but grounding. "That's all that matters." The silence settled between them, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful, like the world had shifted just enough for them to breathe. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. The air between them was full of understanding, of shared grief and shared strength. It wasn't about fixing anything, about making everything right. It was about acceptance, accepting what had been lost, accepting what had been found, and accepting the fact that, for the first time in a long time, Eli didn't feel the need to run. The sun was fully up now, casting its light across the land, and Eli knew that whatever came next, whatever the land took from him, whatever the fire had burned, he would face it. Not alone. Not anymore. With Josie by his side, the weight of the past didn't feel so heavy. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't suffocating him either. And for the first time in years, Eli felt the faintest stirring of hope. "Let's start again," he said, his voice quieter now, as if he were speaking to the land, to the house, to the ashes of the barn. Josie didn't answer, but she didn't need to. She simply nodded, and together, they stepped outside. The ranch was still a ruin. The land was still scarred. But for the first time, it felt like there was room for something new. Something they could build together. And as the sun rose higher, Eli took a deep breath, ready for whatever came next. They were still here. They were still alive. And that was enough.